we have to face the fact that they are murdering people to produce these chemical weapon hoaxes. And what is to say that they didn't do that in Khan Shaykhun? In Eastern Ghouta, there were already questions because parents in Latakia saw their missing children on the video footage from the Ghouta attack.
Welcome to the Last American Vagabond. Joining me again is one of my favorite guests to have on the show, and that is Vanessa Beeley, who is recently in Syria on the front lines of Idlib. Very important to get her on the show to discuss about what's actually happening there, the contrast with the mainstream media, all the information around it, and especially the chemical attack accusations, the OPCW report, all kinds of stuff going on. And I think this is the best person we could have on to talk about it. Thank you for joining me again.
Hi, thanks, Ron. Really good to be back on. I'm a little bit kind of just got back from Syria, so I'm sorry if I'm not kind of totally awake.
It's okay. I'm struggling with a voice issue today, so we're on the same page. Well, I'm glad to have you. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show. But let's kick this off with the discussion of kind of where I feel this is all stemming from, at least the most recent aspect of this in regard to Idlib. And this is the recent offensive kicked off by the Syrian government, the Russian government, to essentially take back what is Syrian sovereign territory, and how this is being misrepresented from both sides. So what are your thoughts on what started this, why they officially decided to begin their offensive yet again, and how that contrasts with what the mainstream media is saying about it?
Yeah. I mean, this basically started, of course, just to give people the background to the huge numbers, the infestation of terrorist groups in the province of Idlib, which, of course, is to the furthest northwest in Syria, bordering Turkey. And, we need to remember that the Turkish-Syrian border has been the rat run for those terrorist groups throughout this conflict. And even before the conflict started, Turkey was responsible for the passage of weapons, militants themselves, chemical weapon ingredients. That has been reported by a number of journalists, including, of course, Serena Shem, who was reporting for Press TV in 2014. And after producing that report, her life was threatened. And she was then, her car was hit by a lorry on the way home. And of course, her family, including her mother, Judith Barr, convinced that she was actually murdered. Because of the information she was and the evidence she was revealing that implicated the Turkish government in the supply or the incubation of terrorism inside Turkey and inside Syria. So basically the groups that are inside Idlib and occupying Idlib, who are of course being financed and promoted and armed by the Western coalition of terrorism, as I call them, and their Gulf state allies, their allies in Israel, in Turkey, and a number of other regional allies. Now these groups, many of them actually came from previously liberated areas, so from East Aleppo, from Eastern Ghouta, from the south, because many of them chose to take the Amnesty and Reconciliation deal offered to them by the Syrian government and negotiated by the Russian amnesty teams to get on the buses, to give up their heavy arms, to get on the green buses as they're known, and be evacuated to Idlib. So basically Idlib has been the collection ground for all of the terrorist groups who previously occupied and terrorized citizens across Syria. So that's just to give you some background of who is there. They are not the moderate rebels that, Western media is still desperately portraying them as. The controlling group is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is an offshoot or a rebrand of Nusra Front, which of course is Al-Qaeda. HTS itself is a designated terrorist group by the UK and by the US. So let's be very clear here. The occupation of Idlib is dominated by a designated terrorist group who are heavily armed. Khalid al-Mahamid, who is the leader of the kind of Saudi-funded and financed, let's call it opposition group. I mean, we know it isn't effectively a Syrian opposition group. It's an external to Syria group that is being pushed and promoted by Saudi Arabia in order to topple the elected and favored Syrian government, favored by the Syrian people. Khaled al-Mahamid said, I think it was around 2 weeks ago, that Nusra Front, HTS, have not only long-range missile capability, they have anti-tank ground missiles. He also admitted that they have chemical weapon capability. Now, when I was last in Idlib, I had a meeting with, I'm not going to reveal my sources, but I had a meeting with 2 military advisors who, let me just say, that they are the best placed to have the information that they gave me. And they told me that basically they were fully aware that HTS, with the help from British and American specialists, had set up chemical weapon manufacturing facilities in 2 towns in Idlib, one in Marat al-Numan and the other in Khan Shaykhun, which of course was the scene of the alleged chemical attack by the Syrian government in 2017, which elicited the response, the aggressive response from Trump of bombing Sharet's airbase at the time. So this is just to give some background of the weapons that are available to these so-called moderate rebels, which are effectively terrorist groups occupying civilian areas and civilian towns in the province of Idlib. Now, in September last year, Russia brokered a deal with Turkey to set up deconfliction zones, basically around the province of Idlib. Turkey has consistently failed to police and to monitor those deconfliction zones. And in fact, we know that Turkey has consistently continued supplying weapons and equipment and allowing weapons and equipment to pass across its border into Idlib to reinforce those terrorist groups. Equally, those terrorist groups have consistently broken the ceasefire. They have violated it by targeting civilians, not military installations, civilians in the towns that are bordering the deconfliction zone, towns like the Syrian Christian towns of Al-Skarbiya and Mahade and surrounding villages. But also in Western Aleppo, where, you know, most recently we've seen children being sniped. We've seen, again, civilian and residential areas being targeted. And in Skarbiya, for example, which I visited again recently in the last few days, last week, 5 children were targeted in this town. Now, of these 5 children, one woman who lost one child in the initial targeting, Bashar, one of her sons. Her second son, Marcel, who was injured in the targeting, died of his wounds a few days later. She had lost her husband in 2014. He was martyred in the Syrian Arab Army fighting international terrorism inside Syria. So this woman's entire life has been destroyed. Her husband lost in 2014 and her 2 children murdered by these Western-backed terrorists in Idlib in the last few days. So just, and this will not be reported in Western media. You know, all you will hear is that the Syrian government and its allies, including, of course, Russia, are targeting civilians in Idlib, are indiscriminately bombing civilian areas. It will never be explained to you that this is a retaliatory action against terrorist atrocities against civilians, Syrian civilians, children. This will never be, I mean, I haven't seen a single mainstream report on the massacre last week because these 5 children were murdered. A monastery was targeted where children come as a sort of community center and makeshift school. But this will never, ever be mentioned in mainstream media.
It's so frustrating to see. It's the same kind of thing we see in Yemen, that they just will refuse to cover it because it exposes the agenda. And it's so contradictory to the reality that we continue to show in the independent media. Excuse me, the reality, like we've shown in the past, that every time the Syrian government retakes an area, all the Syrian people flood back in and life returns. Like you talked about the buses. What a sign of an evil dictator that's willing to rush people out of the way before something happens. You know, I actually recently, I was going to bring it up later, but the story about the Press TV report that Syrian helicopters were already distributing evacuation leaflets in preparation for their military campaign. I mean, these are not things that a dictator seeking to murder civilians would actually do.
Well, I mean, and also this has been going on for some time. I mean, yeah, there have been leaflets dropped in the last 48 hours. But even before that, and again, people are not aware of this, the Abu Duhur humanitarian corridor was opened up for civilians of Idlib to be able to leave. And this was open more than 6 months ago, just to give you an idea. So even before this recent escalation, which, as I say, was provoked by persistent violations of the ceasefire agreement by the terrorist groups, targeting civilians. Again, you know, I have to stress this. They are not targeting military installations. They are targeting civilians. And this has been the pattern of their strategy. If we go back to East Aleppo, what did they used to do? Target civilians in West Aleppo. When eastern Damascus was occupied, they didn't target military installations. They targeted civilian areas, particularly Syrian Christian areas in Damascus, in the Old City in particular. School children, they would wait for school children to come out of a school at around 1 p.m., right? And then they would target the areas there. 30,000 people permanently handicapped in Damascus alone by those mortar and rocket attacks from the terrorists in eastern Ghouta. And this was the pattern throughout all the areas that they occupied. In Idlib alone, I mean, the figures vary depending on, of course, who's producing those statistics. And it's very, very difficult to say the number of civilians that are left in Idlib. But we know, and we're pretty certain, I've had a number of people confirm those figures. There are probably 50,000 foreign terrorist fighters, mercenaries in Idlib, 50,000, which include Chechens, Uyghurs, people from Somalia, from Libya, from Iraq, from all over the world, actually, I mean, and including European fighters. And then I think there's around another 60,000 terrorist fighters. So in total, there's around 120,000, all being armed and financed by the US coalition and their partners in this illegal aggression against Syria, against a sovereign nation.
And what's for people that may, you know, hear this kind of thing and think, wow, that's just not possible. I always go to Yemen because it's such the most obvious example today, but there's many fields of war we could point this at, but the Saudis today, with direct US support, continue to bomb obvious food installations, water supplies, you know, and then claim they just say we're hitting military installations, right? So there's precedent all over the place for US actions doing exactly this, and not even just proxy wars, but just, you know, US-led wars. But the question that I would ask that maybe people that are just tuning in that are, you know, want to question all we have to say, you can clearly show mountains of evidence that these groups, and that are also mountains of evidence that these groups backed by the US, and the evidence that they are killing civilians. We can see this. It's countered by Western media, but there's a lot of it. But on the other side, even if, and I do agree, the evidence shows that Russia and Syria are responding to attacks, you know, not even just in this area, but I talked about the Hamaim air base being bombed with drones. I mean, they're getting bombarded, so it only matters when they have to attack. But in their attacks, are they also then potentially killing civilians, right? Because I think that's what somebody would want to ask.
Well, I think, I mean, you know, what's extraordinary, I mean, I'll mention very quickly the Sky News report, and I know we'll come back onto that in more detail. But for example, let's take the Sky News report, where Sky News are claiming that the Syrian government has deliberately targeted them. Now, let's put this into context. Sky News entered Idlib province illegally. They entered probably by the Turkish border. They had escorts, which were basically going to be Nusra Front, because Nusra Front control this area. So they were embedded with a terrorist group, a UK-US designated terrorist group. They were accompanied by Bilal Abdul Karim, who is a terrorist reporter and a recruiter for the terrorist forces, a sectarian, violent upholder of extremist law. How on earth could the Syrian government even know they were there? They hadn't alerted anyone in the Syrian government to their presence. They were embedded with terrorists. But my point is, it's interesting in the Sky News article, because they basically talk about this indiscriminate bombing, as you've just mentioned, but then they actually say, but this area was completely free of civilians. They'd fled the area. So it's like, hold on, you know, you can't have it both ways. You can't have it that this is indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas and then tell us that, but actually there were no civilians in this area. So clearly, you know, what is being bombed, and again, we've seen this kind of hysteria and sensationalism. You know, we've even seen Idlib being described as Armageddon. I mean, we're going one step further from, what was it, Guernica and Srebrenica for Aleppo and Eastern Ghouta. But we know the history of this conflict teaches us that these terrorist groups occupy first and foremost hospitals and schools, right? Because these are big buildings. They are multi-complex buildings. They always have an entire kind of network of basements, which of course give them protection from the bombing raids. And these schools and hospitals are generally converted into either prisons and Sharia law centers for the terrorist groups in order to imprison and execute and torture civilian residents in the area, or they are converted into military headquarters. We saw this throughout the conflict. And in fact, if we go back to when the US was bombing or obliterating Raqqa, claiming it was liberating it from ISIS, of course, what was its excuse when it was bombing hospitals? Oh, but ISIS occupied the hospitals. So we have one rule for when the US is obliterating civilian areas in Syria, compared to when the Syrian government and its allies are effectively cleansing areas of terrorist occupation. So, you know, this is complete hypocrisy yet again on behalf of the Western media, which, you know, nowadays we cannot perceive them as journalists. We can only perceive them as an extended PR agency for state policy, particularly inside Syria, or as you said, in Yemen, in Venezuela. It doesn't matter where it is. We don't see any deviation from state policy, aggressive state military adventurous policy. And so, look, this is a war. Civilians are going to be injured in a war. They're going to be affected hideously by war. But who actually instigated this conflict inside Syria? Who actually created the misery and the suffering that the Syrian people are enduring? And that includes, of course, the economic sanctions that are collectively punishing the Syrian people for refusing to stop supporting their government, their state, their army. The Syrian army is the Syrian people. This is another very important point to make here. It's a conscript army. Every single soldier in the Syrian army comes from the families inside Syria. Every family inside Syria has suffered the loss of a son, a husband, a brother, a daughter, a sister, right, who are fighting in the Syrian Arab army to defend their country. This is defensive action from the Syrian people against an externally imposed terrorist force that threatens to overrun them and impose upon them an extremist sectarian puppet regime that will comply with US policy and, of course, Israeli policy in the region.
Yeah, which I would say is clearly the main agenda behind most of these regime change wars is to align them with their interests. But the hypocrisy, I'm so glad you pointed that out, because it's something I've really been drilling down on over the last so many months. It's just the overt hypocrisy and the use of the law as a tool against their adversaries. And while it doesn't apply to them, right? The same thing you said, well, oh, give them the benefit of the doubt when they're bombing something. But on the other side, no, it's because, you know, they're just the bad guy and that's it. Like, it's just, there's no real justification behind it. But I think what's important to point out, and which is you were saying the same, is that, you know, the Syrians and the Russians, their militaries, their history so far in this illegal invasion, as it were, there is very clearly they've been taking every possible step to try to avoid hurting people, hurting civilians. I mean, it's been very clear. Does that mean they're not right now trying to kill civilians? No, but the evidence is there, and I think it's very obvious, and we have to go based on what we can see in front of us, right? You could jump to any kind of conclusion, but that thing's so important to point out. But at the end of the day, we can see on the flip side, like you said as well, that they're very clearly targeting civilians from the extremist side, and there's mountains of evidence for it. And since you mentioned it, we can go ahead and get, you know, further elaborate on the Sky News report, because I saw the report by Robert Inlakesh on Press TV, also confirming what you said as well is that there are no civilians in these areas, and they're still already claiming that, as well as the interesting point that I saw is that, again, and we'll get into the chemical accusations after this, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham was the source for this. And they're it's amazing that they can, out of one side of their mouth, pretend that Al-Qaeda is responsible for attacking us 9/11. They're still the goal of all of their, war on terror efforts around the world, and then use the same terrorist organization as a source for their material. I mean, I can't wrap my mind around that. So feel free to elaborate on Sky News.
There's also an ISIS kind of offshoot operating, Haras al-Din, I think, operating inside Idlib. So, suddenly the whole kind of anti-ISIS campaign seems to have disappeared down the drain because, let's not mention that they're in Idlib as well, because then people will start questioning, why. But I think also coming back to the civilian issue, again, historically, when we followed the liberation of Aleppo and Eastern Ghouta, we know that the Syrian government and Russia set up the humanitarian corridors to enable civilians to leave. But we also know that the terrorist groups, charge ridiculous amounts of money. I know that in Idlib, for example, they're charging maybe $500 per head for people to be able to leave safely by the humanitarian corridor. You're talking people that have absolutely no financial means to be able to pay that kind of money. But then even when the civilians are trying to use the humanitarian corridor, they're being shelled and sniped and killed by the terrorists. Why? Because the terrorists don't want to lose their human shields. Right? Let's go back to Douma in Eastern Ghouta, Jaish al-Islam, which is a terrorist extremist group whose PR, by the way, is actually paid for by the British government. And of course, we know they were embedded or collaborating with the White Helmets, and the White Helmets were effectively producing the PR for this terrorist group. But Jaish al-Islam, for example, were putting civilians in cages in 2015 and parading them and putting them on roofs as human shields. And so therefore, the casualties among any civilians that are left in Idlib, in the cities that are being cleansed of this terrorist occupation, are quite possibly, again, I mean, I can't say it categorically, and we won't know until we interview people after the liberation again, will be being used as human shields, because historically, these same groups that are in Idlib were in Eastern Ghouta, were in East Aleppo. They're not going to change their strategy overnight and become the good guys. This is what people need to do, is to make the connection that these guys haven't suddenly kind of turned up in Idlib. No, they came from areas where they were for 5 years, 6 years, conducting the most appalling atrocities against civilians. I interviewed a woman who was held in Toba jail, the Jaish al-Islam jail in Douma, repentance jail as it translates into. She described to me 5 years of hell. She was tortured on an almost daily basis, kept in solitary confinement. These are not, these people are monsters. What they have done to the Syrian people is monstrous. And these are the same people that are now in Idlib. They're not going to change their strategy. They're not going to change their mentality. They're not going to change their entire ideology overnight.
I'm glad you brought up
the people that Sky News are embedded with.
Exactly. I know. And that's what's so, again, that was the source, and they're interviewing, and it's just crazy that they can flip back and forth by, using them one day and claiming they're fighting them the next. But I'm glad you brought up that woman, the tweet that you had shared. I wanted to ask, because it's almost shocking. Was that the same woman in one picture? That is unbelievable. I'll make sure and share that with everyone. The hair change. You can see what hell that this person must have gone through. And that was shocking to me. I almost didn't want to, I said, that can't be the same person. It's absolutely crazy. But
I'll be kind of doing a full report on what she told me. But basically, she also told me of the fact that the terrorists themselves were using the prisoners as basically as lab rats. They were injecting them with drugs. They were testing drugs on them. Now, what is interesting is one of the drugs they were testing would knock people unconscious for up to 4 days, right? Now, if we go back to the chemical attacks, and if we look at some of the footage of these chemical attacks, particularly there was one in Samin in March 2015, and the Swedish Doctors for Human Rights did a fantastic analysis of that attack. But if we look at the children used in that attack, they look drugged, right? And this is something that I've been following up on. And when she just by chance said to me, oh, and by the way, you know, they used to test drugs on the prisoners. And she talked about one of her relatives that was injected with this drug. And he passed out. He was basically unconscious for 4 days. So, you know, this is, the thing is, what people really need to understand is the absolutely psychopathic element that is being exposed among these so-called moderate rebels, who are effectively mercenaries, professional fighters, terrorist entities, and what they will do to achieve their goals. This is something that is, you know, you mentioned the Duma attack. And what is now coming to the surface is that it's very possible that those victims who were shown on video had been murdered by the group that produced the chemical weapon attack staging, right? And yet, despite that, and this is what is extraordinary, you're quite right, is now we're being told there's a chemical weapon attack in Idlib, on their sort of mountain range going into Latakia, produced by the same people that potentially murdered the alleged victims in Duma. And with the release of the engineers report, that the working group on Syria media and propaganda, which was established by Professor Piers Robinson and colleagues, has exposed, yet again, we had already the knowledge that the hospital scenes had been staged, right? But now we have to face the fact that they are murdering people to produce these chemical weapon hoaxes. And what is to say that they didn't do that in Khan Shahun? In Eastern Ghouta, there were already questions because parents in Latakia saw their missing children on the video footage from the Ghouta attack. I mean, this is like, I mean, it is so horrendous what is being done here. And we are seeing the criminal media in the West, again, running with a narrative from the groups that may have murdered children in Ghouta to achieve the same thing. And is this a distraction from the fact that they're being exposed, that the OPCW is being exposed as a political weapon by the latest revelations on the Duma attack? Suddenly we get a chemical attack in Idlib. And also, as you know, we're hearing that because Turkey has been unable, or let's not say unable, it has actually effectively reneged on the deal of securing the deconfliction zones and removing its military points from those zones, right? So it's basically broken its deal with Russia. And so now Russia is saying, okay, now we go for the full campaign. Now we are cleansing this area. But we need to understand this, Ryan. I was in El Skedibia a few days ago. I was woken up at 4 a.m. by the sound of Grad missiles coming into the town. And at that night, the terrorist groups had attacked back into the deconfliction zone. They killed a huge number of Syrian Arab Army soldiers that night in that counterattack. With each counterattack, potentially, they come closer again to threatening those Syrian Christian towns whose children are at risk and whose civilians are at risk. So any government in its right mind is going to do what it can to protect its civilians, right?
Absolutely.
But those civilians are not known about. That's the problem. You know, your viewers are not going to even know about those civilians because they're never talked about by Western media.
Absolutely. It's sad. And it's a conscious choice by these people to obfuscate what's really going on. I mean, there's an interesting parallel though with the White Helmets coverage you've done in the past about the report in the United Nations about the, you know, child trafficking, human trafficking, and, you know, the aspect of the drugs and being out for 4 days is very interesting to think about how that could be used, and even just more nefarious aspects of other things that might have been happening. You know, it ties in with this same idea. Even kind of ties in with the idea of the same way we talk about them testing weapons on Palestinians to say they're war tested. Same kind of idea may be applied here with something else that we don't even want to get into. I mean, it's very alarming stuff to think about. But as you said, this stuff is very easy to see that this stuff is happening. And the chemical accusations, and I do want to get into the OPCW leak as well. But the chemical accusations here are very interesting, as you said, because I want to point out again that it's been made clear that these accusations were also coming from groups like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, at the very least repeated by them. And then the United States comes out with no investigation and basically threatens Assad, you know, we're going to look into this, right? And it's unbelievable how willing they are to take the word of the very people they pretend they're fighting. It just doesn't make any sense to me. But, you know, what did you see? What did you find on the ground, or, you know, your insights on, because as far as I can tell, it looks like the supposed chemical attack, just like in the past, didn't even actually happen. So what were your thoughts on it?
On the Duma
No, the most recent, the May 9th supposed chemical accusation. As far as I can tell, it was just a simple accusation by terrorists that the U.S. chose to believe. So what were your thoughts on it?
Well, I mean, you know, there is, again, we're in this situation where why on earth would the Syrian army, you know, a professional army, use something as really ineffective as chlorine? Why? What's the point? You know, and the thing is that, you know, the claim is always that there is no evidence that the terrorist groups have chemical attacks. Well, again, I was in the area a couple of months ago when 5 villages were attacked with a toxic gas by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, by HTS. And 30 victims were brought into Al-Skalbiya hospital. I went in and interviewed them, and the symptoms were of a chlorine, a type of chlorine or organophosphate poisoning, right? So who is using chemical weapons here? You know, I mean, that's the extraordinary thing. And actually one of the things that I'm trying to work on is the documenting of all of the chemical attacks carried out by the US coalition proxies, the terrorist groups, inside Syria since the beginning of the conflict. And actually, it's a huge number. I was talking this time with a number of organizations in Syria that sort of follow, including the coroner's office, that follow through on these kind of attacks. And actually, there's been a huge number. But again, of course, they're never highlighted by Western media. They are rarely recorded, either by the UN or by the OPCW. I mean, we still haven't heard, for example, anything from the OPCW about the attack on Western Aleppo last year. To my knowledge, there has not been any statement by the OPCW on that attack carried out against residential areas to the west of Aleppo. So, you know, as far as I'm concerned, the timing, it's always the timing. Just as we see an escalation, just as we see a determination of Syria and Russia to finally cleanse this area, we suddenly get a chemical attack. Same thing happened in Ghouta, eastern Ghouta, or Duma. As the Syrian army was closing in, suddenly they decide to use chemical weapons, right? And a point that I think it was the Syrian representative to the UN in New York, Dr. Bashar Jafri, he made. It's funny how the Syrian government only ever really target children. Like, you know, where are the grown-ups? It's ridiculous. This is an entire PR and marketing exercise. It's a black op operation carried out to criminalize the Syrian government and to enable military intervention, particularly by France, by the UN Security Council permanent members, France, the UK, and America. Because let's just think about what is going to be revealed if Idlib is fully liberated, right? Again, I had a discussion with the head of the coroner's office in Damascus when I was there, and he confirmed what I was thinking, that the majority of, for example, the organ trade operations are being run from Idlib on the border with Turkey. The bodies are being taken into Turkey, into hospitals there for organ extraction. But the main area of this operation is the north of Idlib on the Turkish-Syria border. The white helmets, for example, in Khalat al-Madik, which was previously occupied by Al-Qaeda on the borders, about 500 meters away from Al-Skalbiya, the Christian town. There was a massive white helmet center there underneath the Nusra Front Center, which was an old, like a wheat factory, right? And the White Helmet Center was underground. Now, in that White Helmet Center, we found UK manufactured hazmat suits, chemical suits, right? So we know that at some point they are going to instigate a false flag, which will enable the French, UK, US alliance potentially to bomb Idlib. Now, my prediction is if that does happen, they will be bombing areas to hide evidence. That's my strong feeling. And of course, I've always thought that. I thought that even when they bombed or threatened to bomb Damascus after the Duma alleged attack, my immediate thought was, okay, what are they going to try and hide? Right. But in Idlib in particular, people should understand that Idlib has been the terrorist center, but it's also been very probably occupied by British, American, French specialists who are enabling and helping these terrorist forces to improve their capability of aggression against the Syrian forces, right? I mean,
absolutely.
What kind of moderate rebel has long-range missiles, Grad missiles, right? Anti-tank ground missiles. I mean, the sophistication of the weaponry of these groups has got to set off alarm bells at some point.
Yeah, it's overtly obvious to anybody that actually tries to think about it, to see that they're getting help from somewhere. It's obvious.
Yeah.
But what's interesting to point out in that discussion, I truly think that what's happening here is, like you said, the use of the false flags. And first of all, false flags, people need to understand that this is a historically documented fact. This has happened. It's happened in the United States. It's happened well before the United States ever existed. People today seem to pretend like those don't exist. But it's aimed at emotionally manipulating the opinions, as you've pointed out many times, specifically of English-speaking people. That's why we see that the white helmets happen to have, just interestingly, English writing on their jackets. And it's like, but weird, they're working in Syria. It's weird how that works. It's clearly they're trying to direct this at us. And I think that's what it's all about, is manipulating us to manufacture consent for what we're seeing here. And I think, and that's what's very clear. And it's some of the points that I was thinking about, the chemical weapons, like you pointed out. And Moon of Alabama's done a great job on this, that they're not effective, right? They do not.
Exactly.
They don't kill. A bomb would kill many more people. So that's why it makes sense that the rebels would use this in order to carry out the agenda, to give them the excuse they need. And people like you and I, this is just like, this is obvious, but we just try to walk people through it. And you just have to start thinking logically. And as I always come back to, the only reason this stuff makes sense after you listen to the logic is just that, Assad bad guy. That's it. Like, that's the rudimentary level that they bring you to, is just, well, he's a bad guy, so he must be doing bad things, right? It's ridiculous. Yeah. And then we get into the OPCW report, which, as we covered and you covered at the time, it was already questionable, showing you the clear placement of those canisters and all this other information. But now it gets even crazier when we get the leak that even Theodore Postel from MIT is covering now, showing us that they withheld information, which you already mentioned, the engineering report, right? So, give us elaborate more on this for people that may not know the story, and what you think this means, and, what this should be doing. Because, I think this should be groundbreaking news right now.
Well, yeah, I mean, the working group, which was set up by a number of academics, as I said, led by Professor Piers Robinson, and it would be great maybe for you to have Piers on to discuss this, because he's way more, involved in it than I am. But the engineer report was basically silenced by OPCW. So effectively, the engineers report was commissioned by the FFM, the investigatory sub-team of the OPCW. But then it appears that its findings were not acceptable to the OPCW, which then raises the question, to what extent is the OPCW politicized and influenced by the UK, France, the United States, and other members of the alliance, the regime change alliance inside Syria? And, you're right. I mean, this is a scandal. This is outrageous that information has been withheld from the public and manipulated. So the final report cannot be considered anything other than a manipulation of our opinion. And this is absolutely, it's outrageous. right? This is a body affiliated to or connected to the UN, which should be preventing war. And what it is effectively doing is enabling war and sustaining perpetual war globally, not only in Syria. I mean, this is, and the silence from the media. I mean, it's only just now cracking through into some kind of mainstream. I think Robert Fisk wrote something, at least, in The Independent today. But it's extraordinary. I mean, the absolute silence. You could hear a pin drop after this. And then, of course, the claims that the report is not genuine, which, of course, then was disproven by the OPCW itself, who fully accepted that this was an authentic report. So, you know, questions should be raised at every possible level, because this entire alleged attack is what enabled our government to carry out an unlawful aggression. It was unlawful anyway, against a sovereign nation, which could have resulted in the deaths of civilians. Had, you know, the Syrian air defenses not been working as well as they were, they would have done. I was in Damascus when those missiles came in.
I remember that.
So I'm actually kind of speechless on this, that's such a groundbreaking revelation. And, you know, my absolute admiration for this small group of academics who've come under the most concerted attack by media, by fellow academics, who now clearly are shown to be embedded again with NATO policy, with their own government foreign policy of militarism and adventurism, right?
It's such an obvious example when they come out over the top to attack something before it's even been fleshed out.
Yeah.
I mean, the mainstream media is making it very clear.
Exactly. You know, but I mean, absolutely, I want to absolutely publicly say it's the victory of perseverance and integrity and a strong moral compass over the moral bankruptcy of our media and our governments.
Absolutely. And I think, as I believe Caitlin Johnstone pointed out, I'm sure many others did as well, this should immediately call into question everything they've done and everything they will do following.
Exactly.
You know,
exactly.
and it doesn't mean that there's not maybe some good people there, or maybe that, you know, but as always, and I say this regardless, whether or not this event happened, we should still always be questioning what we're given by official figures, right? So that we don't do that nowadays is crazy to me. But we should definitely be questioning anything that comes from them and think about how this ties with all of them. And as you pointed out, Duma and all the rest of them, you can see clearly that now at the very least, they're open to manipulation. But then we also add on all the things we've already shown. It's obvious that we're being lied to in all of these from not just media or people associated, but official sources, which is what I think the average person watching that may be new to this needs to reconcile, right? That things you may think you can trust are lying to you. And that connects perfectly with the next thing I wanted to get into was a video that you put out showing that inside Syrian hospitals that had been taken over by Nusra Front, which we've been talking about, during the terrorist occupation of East Aleppo. And your video, you can see the presence of UOSSM, Union of Medical Care and Relief Organizations, and SAMS, which is the Syrian American Medical Society. So can you elaborate on what that means, that these are there while under terrorist occupation for the people watching?
Yeah, I mean, basically what the UOSSM is an umbrella for all of these medical associations and NGOs who claim to be working inside Syria, providing humanitarian aid. But in reality, where they are working is in, as you said, hospitals in East Aleppo, for example, like the M10 hospital, which was across the street from the Nusra Front headquarters, which then, of course, was a shared complex with the White Helmets. But which was effectively occupied by Nusra Front and affiliated extremist organizations. And again, as I said, you know, what we're seeing, I mean, if we also look at Robert Stewart's incredible kind of forensic investigation of the BBC Panorama Saving Syria's Children. But for example, doctors from within that sort of chemical attack hoax, have collaborated with other members of the, what I call the PR production cluster, to criminalize the Syrian government and the Syrian army and its allies, into a group called Medics Under Fire, or Doctors Under Fire. And all of these organizations come under the umbrella of the UOSSM. They are effectively embedding themselves with terrorist-held hospitals and areas. So whether it's in East Aleppo and in Idlib, they're operating in Idlib as well, raising money for supposed humanitarian aid. But, you know, we have, again, a history in this conflict of so-called humanitarian aid ending up in the hands of the terrorists. I mean, what I think people need to see this as is almost like it's a mafia operation, right? So there's money laundering going on, there's drug running going on, there's gun trade going on, there's prostitution, there's everything that you can possibly attribute to mafia operations is what these terrorists are running. And what these so-called medical associations are doing is collaborating with those terrorist groups. And don't believe that these hospitals are treating civilians. Again, let's go back to East Aleppo. All of the civilian testimonies told me that they were not treated in these hospitals. Fighters, terrorists were given priority over civilians. Civilians were actually left to die in the streets. Many of them, if they were injured, had their limbs amputated because the terrorist medical organizations didn't want to deal with them, right? So there's nothing humanitarian about what any of these groups are doing. And I would actually question the role of organizations like SAMS and Syrian American Medical Society in relation to, and I'm just raising the question here. I don't have any evidence of it yet, but I'm raising the question. You need doctors to extract organs. If there is an organ trade operation being run here, there have to be doctors involved in that operation.
Absolutely.
And I'm not going to take that any further, but I'm raising the question because I have to raise that question for myself.
Absolutely.
You know, the terrorists are not trained in medical procedures like this. You need doctors. So where are those doctors coming from? And the only medical experts who are coming in and working exclusively with the terrorist groups are these organizations under the umbrella of the UOSSM.
Absolutely. And it's a very logical question to be asking. I mean, and like we've said on our previous interview where we talked about this, that it's important for the average person to understand, similar to the idea of a false flag, that organ trafficking, human trafficking, is shockingly common today. And especially in groups in areas like this in war zones, and especially in terrorist-held areas in war zones. So it's important for people to think about that that happening is not something that's actually that far outside the realm of possibility. And then to think about what you're saying is that these groups, these medical groups, are embedded in terrorist areas where you could also show some of them, like you said in Idlib, there's the lack of civilian population anyway. So what are they doing there? What's involved? I mean, this is what journalists should be asking, except we have the mainstream media who's just regurgitating what they're told. So that's why it's so fantastic to have people like you out there digging into this kind of stuff and asking the right questions, right? So I really appreciate you being here today. Is there anything else you wanted to throw in there for everybody? I'm sure we'll probably touch base again as this continues to develop.
Yeah. The one point I wanted to make, actually, I just quickly thought of it, is in the military operations to clean the deconfliction zone and to reduce the threat of targeting of civilian areas on the towns on the border of these zones. One very important point, many of the army officials and spokespeople said that they could not have made those gains as quickly as they did without collaboration from civilians living under terrorist occupation. So this is a very important point to make. So these civilians who are apparently being indiscriminately targeted by the Syrian Arab Army, right, were actually helping the Syrian Arab Army to advance and to retake terrorist-held areas. So again, we're seeing that this is not about, this is about civilians and army working together to free themselves of this heinous terrorist occupation and infiltration of their country that has caused unbelievable, unimaginable suffering to the Syrian people for 8 years. We need to really stop hearing the word rebels and moderate. Forget that. This is really not what we're talking about here. We're talking about, I mean, Sky News made some ridiculous comments about, oh, the Syrian government is, you know, taking more Syrian territory. Well, hello. I mean, really, we should be behind the Syrian army right now. Because believe me, the ending of the terrorist occupation in Idlib is not only for Syria, it's for all of us. Because where do we think those terrorists are going to go if they're enabled to leave Syria?
Absolutely. We saw them shuttling the white helmets all around, or, you know, claiming to be. Yeah. So it's very clear that this is something that's going to be outsourced and spread. And, you know, it's like you said, it's ridiculous to see the claim, like now they're clearly, after their most recent narrative kind of got immediately demolished by the independent media, they're now calling for a ceasefire, which I think is ridiculous, again, of a conflict that they're creating. And what I think is interesting to think about, just like you said, is that ultimately what they want is this ceasefire to seem, you know, like a level-headed thing to do. But all it ultimately means is that they're going to want to maintain occupation of these territories forever, as opposed to the Syrian government taking back what's rightfully their territory, right? It's all about framing this in a way that manipulates the average person, right? And that's what it all comes down to. But thank you for coming on again, and I appreciate all your insight. I mean, truly no better person to have on in this discussion, and I'm sure we'll touch base again as this develops. And for everyone out there, as always, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.
OPCW.